make sure that the video comes up on Twitch itself. Right. It says it's streaming. Well, I think it's live. The video's not showing up for me today. The mobile app is failing me. Guess I will log into the web page and make sure that my video is showing up on the website. Oh, look at that. It is live. Okay. I am convinced that it is working. As you join, please say something in the chat room. And even if you're watching this recording in the future, it's one of the most technical live streams of the whole semester. It won't be nearly as long as last week's, but we are going to be talking about MySQL and relational databases and queries, which are a little bit unlike any of the HTML and JavaScript and CSS that we've been writing for the last semester or two. So it'll be brand new for everyone, and that's why in Moodle this week there's a special activity about database definitions. And the goal of this assignment is to help you become more comfortable and familiar with the terminology used inside of databases. So the terms that I want you to research and develop your own definitions for are records, tables, forms, queries, data types, relationships, fields, primary key fields, and foreign key fields. Now, you might be wondering, how can you define these things if you've never worked with them before? How do you define one of these without mentioning the others? The good news is that I want you to write your definitions using the other words. I want you to start building the connections between these terms, and that is going to help the concepts gel in your mind. And it's okay if you're not as familiar with some of these words as you are with others. I'm counting on your familiarity with some of them, leading you to a better understanding of the others. And when I've taught this class face-to-face, I've actually done this on a whiteboard. And you can emulate this, on your own on paper if you want. You can take each one of these terms and find a way to describe it using the other words that are listed. So tonight, when I talk about the MySQL WordPress database, I will be using these terms, and you'll hear me connect them to other terms just by describing how they work. You're going to be able to use this live stream, any of your internet searching, and the LinkedIn Learning videos that I've provided alongside of this week's materials. There are two video series. One is specific to MySQL, and it's very long. It's about 4 hours. But the good news is that I think at least a good fourth of that video series is about installing WordPress. It's about installing MySQL. And we did that last week when we installed WordPress. So you can skip ahead in that video series. And then the second video series that I linked to was about relational databases in general. And relational databases are a type of database that try to organize information with without replicating or duplicating the data extensively. So you may have taken another class that has worked with relational databases. If you've used Access, which is taught in our CIS 100 and our CIS 130 courses, that's a relational database. Other ones that are popular, obviously, are MySQL, the one that we're looking at this semester, Postgres SQL, SQLite, Microsoft SQL Server. Those are all, even Oracle, those are all relational databases. So this activity is supposed to be in your own words. Write about each one of these terms using the other terms to describe it. It's a special type of forum where you have to actually reply to something that I've written, and you won't be able to read what anyone else has written until you post in that forum. Looks like many of you have already started, so that's awesome. Those are looking good. The other assignment that you'll be turning in is going to be about the WordPress database. And so it's a journal, kind of like your other weekly journals where you document what you've been working on, what questions you have. But the main prompts of this journal are going to be what database tables store the page content that you've posted so far. And we will look at that specifically in tonight's live stream. Write a SQL query that displays this content. In a relational database, efficient storage is a top priority. Normal, in quotes, form encourages that information be stored only once, and duplicate instances of that information be abstracted as references. This is a very confusing sentence, but I can promise you tonight that you will see this in action inside of WordPress, and it's going to make sense when we take a look at it. The best way to see this in action is to find another table that contains information related to the pages and posts that you've identified. Write a query that joins those two tables together. We are going to do that tonight. And then I gave you a list of tables to consider looking at, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But after you watch tonight's live stream, I think you'll be prepared to investigate these tables on your own. And then the last prompt in this journal is what happens when you update a page from the WordPress admin area. Can you update this information directly in the database? Write a query that does this. We'll have a brief query that does that as well tonight. So that's your main journal this week. I don't have anything else I want to mention to get started, so let's dive into the CRUD live stream notes. I have a link to this in Moodle right next to where you find the link to this recording. The word CRUD, besides just being funny, it's an acronym. I've capitalized all the words. I think it stands for create, read, update, and delete or destroy. The D I always get mixed up. But these are basically the four types of queries that you will write against the database. I've organized some examples down below, and we're going to take a look at those. But the first thing that we have to do is get connected to our virtual machine. Remember, I am not running VirtualBox on this live stream computer because it can't handle it when I'm doing the live stream. Instead, I am running WordPress and MySQL on a server on the other side of this basement. I'm going to connect to it with SSH, and you can connect to your VirtualBox VM with SSH as well. If you're on Windows, you'll have to use PuTTY. I am on a Mac, so I am actually going to use the terminal application right here. And I need to connect with SSH. I'm going to list my username, and then the IP address. And before I embarrass myself, let's make sure that IP address, 192.168.7.108, actually goes to my WordPress site, and it does. So that's good. I did have a student who contacted me when they were working on an assignment because when they turned on their VM, they couldn't get to it anymore. And I think what happened is that it had been powered off long enough that when it turned on next, it got a different IP address. Sometimes these 192 addresses are on a specific DHCP reservation or like a renewal or release schedule. And so especially if you were like on the mid network in the computer lab, likely every week if you restarted the computer, you get a different IP address. That might happen in your home as well. In this case, it was fine that her IP address changed because it was before she had installed WordPress. If your VM has changed IP addresses since you installed WordPress, there is a good chance that you will get an error message when you try to visit WordPress. And if you don't see it on the front page, you'd probably see it when you try to log in to the admin area. My WordPress is fine, but if you get any errors at this point, reach out in Slack and I will help you get it fixed. And actually, at the bottom of this CRUD document, has some notes about how we were able to fix WordPress using database queries. So even if you can't connect, watch this live stream, and then I'll touch on these queries before we end tonight. Okay, so I know that my IP address, 192.168.7.108 should work. So it's asking me for my password. That's good. This is where you'd want to look at your notes to remember what your password is for SSH. I remembered mine, thankfully. And it looks like my video is a little bit too big. Let me shrink it down here. Okay. If you're in the chat room, if you could let me know if the audio sounds good and if you can read my screen. I've got it about as large as it can go. Once we're connected with SSH, we can connect to our database. So the first thing that we're going to do, if I can move this window down a little bit, is connect to MySQL using a program on the command line called MySQL. Last week when we installed WordPress, we typed sudo MySQL, and you could totally do that again, but that's going to connect you as the root MySQL user, and that would give you access to create tables and create databases and drop them and do some things that I don't want us to accidentally do today. So I have in the notes provided this alternate command. It's MySQL, and then we have to send 2 flags to it. So a -u, and then another space, and I'm going to type in WordPress user because that was the name of the user that I created just for WordPress, and we followed that DigitalOcean tutorial, and it told us to do that. And then I need to put a space and send the -p flag. This flag is going to say prompt me for the password. So if I hit enter now, you'll see it responds with, hey, enter the password. And I'm pretty sure that I left it as the default, the word password, in that DigitalOcean tutorial. So I'm going to hit enter, and hopefully if you're following along, you get this screen as well. Now you can tell that you're no longer in the normal Ubuntu Bash shell because it no longer says your username at the server name. Instead, you're going to be at a prompt that starts with MySQL and then the greater than sign. This is how you can tell that you're in the MySQL program. This is a REPL. We've worked with them in the Web Inspector activity, with the console, the JavaScript console, how a REPL reads, evaluates, prints, and loops. You're going to be able to type MySQL commands. They will be evaluated. Queries are essentially questions that you ask of the database. MySQL is going to interpret your question, find the answers, and send it back to you. And we'll stay here at the MySQL prompt waiting for more. There is a subtle difference, though, with this REPL. Rather than every time you hit enter, evaluating it and printing, MySQL by default wants to wait and give you the chance to type in commands across multiple lines. So every time you are done writing a command or a question or a query, you have to use the semicolon to tell MySQL that. Otherwise, it's going to just sit there waiting for more. So I'm going to type my first command, show databases, and then semicolon. That's my first question. It's now saying what databases are out there, and it comes back with 2, Information Schema and WordPress. WordPress is that database that we created last week. We installed WordPress. All of its content is in there. So I can tell MySQL that I want to ask my questions against that database. So I can type use WordPress, semicolon, and it tells you that the database has changed. So now any query that I write is going to be in the context of the WordPress database. A similar command to show databases is show tables. Databases are a lot like a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet. And if you've worked with them before, you might know that at the very bottom of the screen in Excel, there are tabs. Think of a database as an Excel document. Each one of those tabs is a different table in a database. So if I type show tables, these are the pages in that Excel document, for instance, that contain information, and typically each one of those tabs contains information on a certain theme. So in a database, a table contains information about one thing. For instance, the users table here is going to contain information about the WordPress users. The posts table is going to contain information about WordPress posts. And each one of those tables contains fields and columns. As you research those terms this week, that'll become apparent. Once I've shown a table and I want to see what it contains, I can use another word. I can use describe, WP underscore post. Let's look at that. And notice how when I hit enter, it didn't tell me anything. It actually left another prompt, the dash and then the greater than sign. That's because I forgot the semicolon. It's waiting for something else before it's going to run. It waits until it gets a semicolon before it actually returns the results. So if I wanted to skip having to type that on a second line, I could write that all on one line. So what is in the WP post table? Well, it contains fields. So inside of this table, there will be an ID, there will be a post author, a post date, post status, where's the content? Post title makes sense. Oh, there it is. It was above post title. Post content. Each one of these fields contains information. Think of the fields as the columns in an Excel spreadsheet. You know how if you look at a table, it has like the headings above each column telling you what's in it. Think of these fields as labeling the content that's going to come below. Now, what does that leave in the Excel document? It leaves rows. In a database, the records that are in a table have to contain the same information in the same place. So every single record in the WP post table has to have an ID. Every single record has to have an author, a date, has to have content and a title. As we're building up this visualization of what the database is, the describe table name query allows us to see those fields. Along the left are those names of the fields, and then there's columns that describe the data that's in each field. So underneath type, you'll see big int, that's an integer. It's a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll see some fields are date time fields. For instance, if you were to create a post, you probably want to know when it was created, with the month, the day, the year, even the hour and minute. There are fields like long text and text that contain a lot of characters. And then there's smaller fields that are varchar, variable character. They can contain letters and numbers, but they're not as big as text. So like this one right here, the post status is only 20 characters long. That's the most it can have in it. Some of them are a bit longer. You can have a varchar of 200 characters. But I think that pretty much takes us through all the different types that are in this table. We could look at a few other tables to try to find more, but I think this gives you a good picture. The next column is labeled null. That property of a field indicates whether it can contain emptiness, whether it can contain no value, for instance. It's not exactly the same as typing in the word no or false. Those are all real values. Null is like the absence. It's like a black hole. It's like nothing, absolutely nothing is inside of that field. In this WordPress post table, notice how every single one of these columns requires a value because it doesn't allow null values. And that gets kind of weird because not every post that we're going to write is going to have a date. So it'll actually have a default value of 000000000 filled in whenever something is created. We're going to get back to the key column in a little bit. That's kind of connected to the foreign key and the primary key terms that we'll get to later tonight. The default value I jumped ahead to. The last column is labeled extra, and these are like extra pieces of information about the column. Really, the only field in these tables that's going to have this extra auto increment set on it is this ID field. Every time we create a post in WordPress, it has to have something unique about it. So it assigns a number in the background automatically. It's a number, so it starts at 1 and it increases. So there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up. And every time a new record gets added to WP Posts, the database automatically gives it the next available number. So that's one table in this database. It has fields. Each one of those fields has a type. Let's start doing something with those. Let's scroll down in this document. The next section is about CRUD. The very first part of CRUD is creating. I gave an example query. We're not actually going to type anything into the database by hand because of what I pointed out about this table, how it requires a value in every single one of these fields. I don't want us to have to type all that in one by one. I'll tell you the format though. It's an insert query. You have to tell it which table to put it in. So that it would be something like insert into WP underscore posts. Then you have to list the fields that you're going to populate data in. So post author, post title, post content. Then you separate out the names of those fields with their values. So you have the keyword values, and then in these parentheses you would type the values that you want to put in, and these line up. So field 1 and value 1 are related together. It's going to set the value of field 1 to value 1, so on and so forth. The reason I'm not going to have you type this in is, one, I know a lot of you would copy and paste, and you'll notice that these quotation marks are curved or curled inside of Google Docs. Those will not paste in nicely into the console. You actually have to type the quotation marks yourself. And secondly, I know very few people that actually type insert statements into databases. We build software that will insert the values for us. And in fact, WordPress itself is a much better way to insert records into the database. So if I log into WordPress and I go to the posts area, I can create a new post. My new post. This was inserted into the database. I don't have to worry about typing in a number or anything like that. As soon as I click save or publish, it is in the background, it is writing the SQL queries to insert, to update, to do whatever needs to happen to get that value in the database. So although we're not going to write a lot of create queries tonight, I'm going to make up for it. You are going to be writing read queries, enough read queries to make up for the lack of create queries, I promise you. So the post table is really big, and I'm going to leave that for you to explore some more on your own. Let's look at the smaller table, and that would be the users table. So I could type describe WP users, semicolon. These are the fields that are in there. Users have a login, a password, a nice name, an email, a URL, and a few other. It looks like display name at the bottom. If I want to actually take a look at the data, the records that are in here, I can actually write my very first select statement. So I'm going to type select star from WP users semicolon. I usually get this question in the chat room. I haven't yet tonight, but people often ask, do I need to capitalize select and from? And the answer is no. Oftentimes people who write queries will use software that automatically capitalizes the keywords. The only reason I sometimes do it when I'm typing SQL queries is just because I can spot those words so easily. But I'm going to run this lowercase, and you'll see it does exactly the same thing as if it was capitalized. So if I select all the records from WP users, it tells me that there was one row in that set, and it's really hard to read because it has these placeholders for the data, and then it actually leaves a lot of space for the values. So something like user login and user pass, it allows enough room to display that value, and so it can't fit on this tiny screen. It wraps it, and it gets really awkward. There is another way to write this query. Instead of ending the query with a semicolon, I could end the query with a \G. I forget what this mode is called. I think it's vertical mode. Yeah, vertical format. MySQL, the REPL inside of MySQL is looking for those semicolons to understand when to move on to the next query. I think the semicolon is actually short for the word go. There are other MySQL shortcuts like the /G that will tell it to behave a little bit differently. So if I do the select star from WP users, which is the exact same query as before, but I end it in this \, which is above like the return or the enter key, capital G, it gives me an aligned look at the column name and the value. Now, if you were looking at multiple records, like if the users table had 5 users, it would repeat this whole section 5 times, which would be easier to read, yes, but it would be much more verbose, and it would be duplicating these labels. So there are times when you're going to want to run a select query with that semicolon, and there are times when you're going to want to run it with the \G. I'll give you a few examples of that tonight. In this case, if I just wanted to read all the data for this one record, the \G worked really well. Let's move over to posts. Let's describe WP posts. I think we've already done that. Let's pick a few things that we want to look at inside of here. If I do a select star from WP posts, WP underscore posts, you'll see that that is even more impossible to read because there's actually HTML in the post content field. So let's change that. Let's not query all of the fields. That's what that star means. Let's replace the star with just a few fields like ID and post title. This is where that semicolon comes in handy because it only lists the column name once up at the top and then it shows all the values. If I ran that same query with the \G, it's still pretty legible, but it repeats those labels every single time. So this is an instance where you'd want to use the semicolon, I think. All right, so in my posts table, I've got hello world again. I've got a sample page, privacy policy, auto draft, and then I survived WordPress on LAMP is in there a few times. A post called where does the trash go? If I ran the same query and I added one more column in the comma separated list, if I added post status, you'll see that some of these records have a status of publish. Some say draft, some say auto draft, and some say inherit. That status is actually differing on some of these entries, and that's significant in WordPress. Let's say I wanted to not look at all these. Let's say I just wanted to look at the ones that are published, the actual blog entries that are on my front page. I could write that query again. And by the way, I'm hitting up arrow just to repeat the same query. I can then move my arrow over. And before the semicolon, I'm going to add a where clause. Where is another keyword. So I'm going to say where post status equals, and then in the double quotation marks, I'm going to look for the word publish. Instead of returning all of the records from the table, I am using a where clause that filters it out and it only returns 4 of those 12 rows. These are the published blog entries. Now, what if you wanted to write a different query that actually just listed all of the different post statuses themselves? That I pointed out that publish, draft, auto draft were in here. What if I just want a list of all the possible statuses? You can write a query that uses a function called distinct. So let me write that. Select distinct. And then, like in JavaScript, the function that we're using requires us to send some information to it. We're going to send that information in parentheses. So I'm going to select the distinct post status from WP posts. So I'm not getting any IDs or titles. I am only getting the post status, and I'm getting only the unique ones from this list. So you can see that in my WordPress database, yours is probably a little bit different. I have drafts, I have publish, I have auto draft, trash, and inherit. So that's a fun question to ask. Honestly, most of what programmers do is write queries that select information out of databases. So you'll become very comfortable if you start programming, writing these select queries all on your own. The functions, there's so many of them out there that I provided a link for you to go take a look at all the functions that are available. It's a bit overwhelming, but there's ones in here for counting, checking for nulls, formatting dates, working with JSON now. That's a JavaScript function. That's interesting. I try to think of a few that might be somewhat useful in the terms of the WordPress database. So I came up with selecting the month of the post date from WP posts. It's not super great in terms of our live streams because we installed WordPress in November and it is still November. So I thought that maybe the day function could be better. So these are all the days of the month that we have worked on posts in WordPress. So November 6th was, I think, when I installed WordPress, and tonight is, it's the 12th on our calendar, but it is the 13th in the universal time. I had not caught that until this live stream. That's interesting. So WordPress stores its dates not in the Eastern time, but in 000 in GMT time, and then it converts it back. So that's why these dates look like they're tomorrow. They're actually tonight, just in a different time zone. You can use those functions in the select clause, but also in the where clause too. So if you wanted to just get the days where the month of the post date is 11, that query does basically the same thing. When I live streamed last semester, we had crossed between March and February, or March and April, I think. So those queries were a bit easier to demonstrate. But those are just two examples of functions that you can use inside of MySQL. I think I've got one more down near the bottom. Oh yeah, in the section about fixing WordPress, if your IP address changes, I actually use the replace function to update and replace one IP address with another. So that replace function takes the field that you want to update. One parameter is what you are searching for, and the next parameter is what you're replacing it with. So that's another very handy, very powerful MySQL function. But like I said, most of what programmers and web developers do is just work with information, putting it in, getting it out of databases. So you're going to write far more select statements than anything else. And one thing that you might realize when you take a look at the WP post table, if I just select star, I don't want to select star. Let's select a few things. Let's select ID, post title, and post author from WP posts. You'll see that there's in no way, shape, or form a name of the person who wrote this article or these posts attached to them directly. And I'll prove that by describing WP posts again. There is an author field, but the only thing that it stores is an integer. It's a number, right? So when I take a look here, I can see that 1 was the author of Hello World Again. Who's 1? Well, let me point out by describing another table, the WP users table that we looked at a few minutes ago. Every user has an ID that happens to be a number. So I mentioned relational databases try not to duplicate content. The process of normalization in a relational database is trying to figure out the information that is likely to be duplicated and storing it in its own table. So we can understand that whenever someone creates a post or a page, we're going to want to associate their name with it, but we don't want to have in our table Brandon Kish 100 times if there are 100 posts, because if Brandon wanted to change his name, we'd have to update 100 different posts. So instead, we try to separate out these entities into separate tables so that the users are in one table, the posts are in another table, so that whenever someone writes a post, we don't have to store their name on the post. We just can associate a record from the users table with the post table. What I just described, those are the foreign keys and the primary keys that are listed in your definitions activity this week. How do these foreign key and primary keys work? Well, let me select ID and user login from WP users, and I'll do the backspace G. Notice how in this WP users table, there's only one record. I've only created bkish. I could have created some others, but this will still work. That first user, bkish, has an ID number of 1. So now we know that user 1 is bkish. If I scroll up in my history and we take a look at this query that had selected the posts, author 1 was associated with each one of those posts. This number 1 in the post author field and the ID field in the WP users table, that's a significant part of the relationship here. So it is possible for us to select posts and users and connect the information with something called a join. The way that we write this join is to express the relationship. We will say that the post author field is connected to the WP users table's ID field. These two fields, the ID in users and the post author field in posts, that is a relationship that falls into the primary and foreign key definitions. In the WP post table, post author is considered a foreign key. In WP users, ID is considered the primary key. So a field like post author that contains information that is a primary key in another file or another table is considered a foreign key. I probably should mention this other fact first because I think it'll help. Every single table should have something unique in it to identify it, and that's why WordPress adds this ID field. This is considered the primary key of the post table, of the users table. They both happen to be called ID because there's just no better name for them, but the primary keys are very different. The number 1 means something very specific in the users table, whereas the number 1 represents post number 1 in the post table. So each table should have a primary key, but then when you're trying to reference information about that record in another table, that's when it suddenly becomes the foreign key. So they're just words used to express a relationship and a connection between data. So if I am looking at post author 1, this is a foreign key that connects to a primary key in the WP users table. So I hope that those words have helped explain it. If you're in the chat room, please reply, letting me know if that helps explain it. I did read through some of the definitions that were already shared, and I think several of you have already found that connection. I hope that this demonstration helps. Let's take what we know about that relationship and try to bring both pieces of information, the foreign key and the primary key, onto the same screen at once. So let's start by just getting the post information. Let's say that I want to get the post title, the post author, and the post status from WP_posts. We've done this query once already before. There's nothing new about it. Let's hit up arrow, and what I actually want to do is change this so that the field names actually start with a P dot. So select P.post title, P.post author, and P.post status. And then before you hit enter, go to the end of your line here. Oops. I lost my changes. 1 second. P.post title, P.post author, P.post status. And then I want to change the name of the table where it says WP_posts, add a space, and then a P. What we're going to do is give WP posts a shorter name. People who write database queries hate having to type things out fully every single time. This query is exactly the same. It returns the exact same data. But what we did is we assigned the name of posts, that table, to a shorter value, P. And then we're able to actually specify from which table we want each of these fields. This becomes important when we start getting information from 2 tables at once. So let's start building this query out. Let's try to express the relationship between posts and users by writing a left join. So in the from clause, which I'm going to capitalize this just so that you can see that this is the from clause, we listed WP post P. We're going to use a keyword left join. The left signifies just the order that these things are connected. So post is going to be on your left side. Let me hold my hand up the right way. We're going to put users on the right side. So left join WP_users. And then I need to give an alias to this table as well. I think U is a good shortcut for users. And before I hit enter, let's go add one more field. Let's get U dot. Oh, and what was in that users table? I don't even remember. Let's try to get email. Let's do U dot user_email. So before I hit enter, let's read the sections here. We're selecting some fields. 1, 2, 3, 4 fields. 3 of those fields are from the P table, which connects to WP posts. The last field is the user email field, and that is from the users table. In the from clause, we list the post table left join the users table. We are not quite done yet. I almost forget this every single time. In the left join, we are trying to explain to the query how these two tables are connected with the on keyword. So now we have to explain what fields are the glue that connects these two tables together. And we know this. It was on the P table, it was post author. I think that was the name. Yeah, post author, post underscore author, equals, and then U, and then whatever the name of the field was in the users table. I think it was just ID. If I scroll up, yeah, here's ID 1. So the select clause, the from clause, the left join, and then the on keyword to explain that relationship. And you could write this either way. It could be p.postauthor equals u.id, or it could be u.id equals p.postauthor. If I hit enter, you'll see that now we have data coming from two different tables. The first 3 columns come from the post table, where post author is the foreign key. We join to the users table, where we can use the primary key ID and connect it to the post author value, and then we can grab any of the fields that are in the users table. So in this case, user email, but that could just as easily have been I think it was display name, display underscore name. So now it'll say bkish instead. So there's my name attached to it. That is a very advanced topic, and we covered it in just a few minutes. We have written our first query that joins two tables. You can join as many tables as you want in a highly normalized database, a very efficient database where they don't repeat any information unnecessarily. So you will have a little bit of information in one table, like the posts, a little information in the users, and then information in other tables too. And WordPress has this. If I show those tables again, I can guarantee you that this the post ID is used in other places too. So there's like a WP terms and terms meta and term relationships and post meta. You're going to see primary key and foreign key relationships extend into all of these tables essentially. Posts get used in a lot of different tables, just like user ID gets used in a lot of different tables too. Okay, so now at this point, I think you probably trust me implicitly that you can write joins between more than one table. But I want to prove something else very interesting that WordPress gives us an opportunity to look at. If I select post title, and let's do ID and post title from WP posts, I found myself wondering one day, why are some of my posts listed more than once in the WordPress database? Like, where does the trash go? I survived WordPress on LAMP. My new post. They're listed more than one time. Well, I started goofing around and querying more and more information in here. I added post status. And I found it interesting that the ones that are replicated, I'll see one post status of publish and another of inherited. Where does the trash go? I'll see trash and then inherit. Does anyone have any guesses why these are listed more than once? I'm going to add in one more field in addition to the post status. Oh, I just listed post status twice. I meant to change one of these to post underscore parent. All right, no one's saying it in the chat room. Let me prove to you one way. Let me go find I survived WordPress on LAMP. Go into my WordPress site. Go to all posts. I survived WordPress on LAMP. Let's make a change to it. Let's add the word almost and update that post. Let's rerun my query. Oh, look at that. There were 12 records. Now there's a 13th. The word almost appears here. So it's like I created I saved a change and it created a new record at the bottom. But look at here. Record 5 also has the word almost. Well, I was very confused about how versioning works, but now you can kind of see from this query that every time I make a change on a post, it saves a copy of that. In fact, some of these are like auto drafts, like it's auto saving in the background. But the first time you create that post, the very first number associated, that record that represents the post, that gets saved forever. And then subsequent drafts or changes to that post will always have a post parent of the very first time that post was created. Now, pause for a minute there. My mind exploded at this point. In this table, the WP post table, the post parent is a foreign key. But it's not all that foreign because it's actually talking about values where the primary key is also in the same table. So you can do joins in the same table. This parent-child relationship that we got going on here, where this record, number 5, is always the latest version of that post, but then every save along the way has a record of its own. This relationship is all captured in one table, and you could write a join. I think I had a student 2 years ago now who wrote a join that listed all the parents and children in a query, so you could see how they were related next to each other. I thought that was really cool. But now you know that joins can cross into multiple tables, but also inside of the same tables. And if you were going to write such a query that joined inside of itself, inside of one table, those aliases that we used before with like the P dot and the U dot, let's see where they are. That's where they become even more important because it's going to be the same table name, but you're going to want to give it an alias that is unique. So you'd have the post table with like parent and a post table that's labeled child or something like that, so that it's easier to write the queries. So those are some fancy select statements. I leave it to you to kind of ask more questions of that database. If you're looking for other tables that are interesting to look at, I think post meta is pretty interesting. If you like the categories and tags, those are stored in these term related tables. Users, there's a lot more information about each user that's not stored in the users table. It's stored in a user meta table. Oh, and I missed the most obvious one. Because WordPress was a blogging system, there are tables that store comments. So the comments connect to the post table. Oh, and it hasn't come up yet, but in WordPress, last week when you were taking the tour of WordPress, you were sometimes creating posts and sometimes you were creating pages. They're the same thing. In fact, even if you create media, if you were to upload an image, that actually gets stored in the post table too. So posts was the first table created, but then they just kind of joined pages and all sorts of media and uploads into that same table. Okay, let's see where we're at. So we finished the R's. Let's look at updates. I'm not going to have you write too many update queries. I would like you to try to write one. In fact, I did one earlier today. If I take a look at my list of posts, I changed the name of Hello World again, or it said Hello World. I changed it to Hello World again. That's the update keyword, the name of the table, and then you use the word set followed by the field name and the value that you want to set it to. The most important part of this update query, though, is the where clause. If you were to write just this first part, you can't copy and paste it because of these curly quotes, but if you were to type that in to MySQL and you forgot the where clause, it would update all the records in that table. So every single record, every single draft would be called Hello World again, instead of just the one where the ID is 1. So that's a fair warning there. Deleting is also something I'm not going to have you do in the database. In fact, WordPress also doesn't delete out of the database. This, I think we had one in here. Right here. Where does the trash go? I deleted one of my posts. It actually didn't delete it out of the database. It just changed the status to trash. And WordPress does that so that at any point in time you can actually get back to older versions. So if I go to the trash here, I can see my post called Where Does the Trash Go? And I could restore it. Only when you click the delete permanently does it delete those records from the database. When I was working at Mid, we wrote a lot of systems that would create database records, but very rarely did we ever delete data entirely. We'd always update some sort of field that was like is deleted or is hidden or something like that, because that was a lot safer. Just like with the update query, if you miss the where clause, it would delete all the records out of that table, and that would be a huge risk. So if we try to put all of this together, I left a little bit of troubleshooting advice down at the bottom for if your IP address changes. WordPress, when you install it, tries to keep track of what its URL is inside of the database. It uses the WP options table. So I wrote a query that I'm going to try copying and pasting. Let's see if that actually works. So it uses that \G to put it in vertical mode. I'm selecting all the fields from the WP options table where the option value, so that's this, is like. So this is a new keyword, like, and then in these single quotes, I search for the IP address, but I put on either side of the IP address, I put this % symbol. That's like a wildcard, so it says anything can be in the front, anything can be in the back, as long as it contains this IP address. This returned 2 records. If my IP address changed and I needed to change these to my new IP address, I could use an update query, and I provided that before. I would just have to put into the replace function the name, the new IP, or sorry, the old IP address and the new IP address to change that around. So you might not know your old IP address, but if you were to look for the option site URL, like if I did select star from WP options where option name equals site URL in quotes, I forgot my semicolon, then you'd be able to see what it thought your old IP address was, and then you could write your update query to replace that value. Now again, I have to warn you, this where clause is super important. Otherwise you would run a find and replace on all of the values in that table, and that would be bad. You only want to update the ones that actually contain the IP address. So that is the last query I wanted to talk about tonight. Hopefully this live stream helps you connect the pieces, the fields, the types, the primary key, especially the foreign key, connecting all those terms together. If you have any questions about databases, reach out in Slack, and I'm happy to help this week. I will see you all next week.